Good afternoon. As Kevin said, my name is Jonathan Darling. I'm a lecturer in human geography, and my research is on urban asylum and the negotiations and politics, I suppose, around refugee and asylum sort of integration and issues with that in urban environments. So what I want to talk about for the next 20 minutes or so is around the research that I did for my PhD, the methods that I use, these kind of issues. But I want to begin really with an example of some of the ways in which I actually wrote and thought about some of this stuff. And that comes from a research diary account that comes out of my thesis, which explored my engagement with an exhibition in the city of Sheffield called Moving Here. And this was part of the city's refugee celebrations in 2007. So I'm going to read through this account and then talk a little bit more about the kind of methods that I used and so on. Okay, so Moving Here. Early afternoon, I place a set of headphones tentatively over my head and press play on the CD player. A voice tells me to walk forward into the maze of rooms constructed from thin sheets of wood. I enter a room bisected by a torn sheet of wire with a large hole crudely cut in it. The voice tells me this is the border, while the sound of gunfire fills my ears through the headphones. I move through the wire into the next room. Here I'm confined to a narrow passage of boxes. There's freight and the sound of a distant engine. The claustrophobia of confinement and airlessness jolts me as a voice tells me stories of continental travels of enclosed spaces of human trafficking. From here, I move to a desk. A voice begins to accuse, asking my name, my nationality, my reason for arriving in the UK. An array of forms are thrust into my field of vision, each posing the question, why should we believe you? The questions and accusations of Croydon become a cacophony of protest as I move into a room of stark grey walls, punctured by blood-red lettering, crudely marking the words, "Go home, refugees out." As I look around the walls into a dank cell representing detention, my ears are jostled for attention by jeers at my bogus and scrounging status. These voices fade as I move onwards into a sparse, lighter room. The walls are decorated in beige wallpaper. I see a small, uncomfortable-looking single bed, a bedside table, a lamp, and a functional grey moulded chair, which reminds me of the discomfort of school assemblies. I move on and step out of this constructed world as the voices begin to recount the many and varied contributions that refugees have made to the UK. I step back once again and peer into this series of wooden spaces, considering how these journeys of asylum may never be fully accounted for, through a collage of voices, spray paint, wooden walls and barbed wire. Asylum exceeds. I step beyond the frame of experience in asylum and into the streets of a city created in part from asylum as an experience. So, asylum, essentially, I argue, encountered here through this exhibition, through Moving Here, is a claim for space in some senses. Traversing the plywood construction of a community centre in Sheffield, from the confinement of a lorry to the isolation of an empty bedroom, highlighted the ways in which asylum is itself a prism through which spaces engage with and experience. Moving Here, then, was designed as a moving towards, a means for others to begin to appreciate what it might mean to be an asylum seeker in the UK in some small way. Above all else, then, Moving Here is an experience of space. My PhD set out to argue that these kinds of experiences matter, that in detailing and examining them, we might actually begin to envisage different ways of relating to asylum and thinking about the kind of politics that might lead to. So with these kind of introductory thoughts in mind, I want to do a number of things in this presentation. I want to very briefly just outline the rationale behind my research, which is titled Cities of Refuge, around the kind of centrality of experience to the kind of stuff that I was trying to explore. Then I want to talk a little bit about Sheffield. Why did I focus on this city? Then I'm going to speak through my methods around the intersection between text, context and performance. And then finally I want to offer a couple of challenges, a couple of things that I found to be sort of problematic in my work. So I want to begin then by just outlining what I was attempting to do, because I think that helps to situate why I chose the methods that I chose. So I was focused on exploring particular ideas about hospitality and welcoming, And the reason why I was doing this was because at the time that I was formulating my research, 2004, 2005, the prevalent mood nationally and in many urban authorities was one of public hostility towards asylum and refugee groups. But I wanted to explore whether there might actually be different things going on the ground, different narratives emerging. It seemed to me that there were minor kind of everyday examples of welcoming and what might be termed hospitality, which were being overlooked through simply focusing upon a kind of negative media and policy-based portrayal of asylum seekers in certain ways. So I wanted to suggest that if we look in detail at the political negotiations of asylum in a city, we might see more than simply the story of a hardening public hostility. This story existed, but I was concerned to suggest that there might be more going on as well. And then this, I think, responded to a number of key exclusions if we think about a policy focus. So at the time, I focused largely upon research around asylum, which was centred on a national scale. It was looking at national scale dispersals, media portrayals, representations, and so on. My argument was in part that presenting asylum as this issue of narratives and nations meant that the diversity of actual spatial experience was overlooked here. The kind of lived everydayness of asylum was being ignored. And so the way in which asylum actually encompassed a series of different spaces in the city, the drop-in centre, the city square, the street, the dispersal accommodation, the way in which these things actually come to matter was effectively being ignored. So what I argued asylum studies at this point was lacking was a sense of experience. And it's that I sought to foreground. I didn't want to overlook the vast work that had been done around policy and around national framings and narratives. But I wanted to argue that these kind of governmental, academic and media-based discussions were only one area of negotiation. Asylum did not effectively end there. Rather, the city offered not only experiences of asylum which questioned these kind of dominant, quite hostile narratives, but also experiences which exceed the ability of these narratives to actually represent and make sense of them. There was more going on here. I was trying to think about methods to enable me to get to the heart of some of that more that was going on. So I set out to explore some of these ideas, some of these approaches in the city of Sheffield. And I chose this for a number of reasons. One was that at the time of my kind of choosing of a study site in 2004, 2005, Sheffield was the first city to have signed up to the UNHCR Gateway Refugee Resettlement Programme. So this was a programme whereby the UNHCR globally resettles refugees to different locations. And local authorities in the UK had to themselves sign up to be part of this programme. At this point in time, many local authorities were trying to actually avoid dispersals and trying to kind of move away from this model. And Sheffield was kind of out of the ordinary in the sense they actually tried to promote this notion. And then secondly, during my time in Sheffield, a social movement called City of Sanctuary started up, which was focused upon trying to promote ideas around welcoming and hospitality and these kind of things. So it felt like there were kind of interesting things happening in this city, and that was why I decided to focus there. So what did I do? I engaged in a kind of multi-method approaches, by the sounds of it, some of the other speakers will be talking about today as well. And this was to kind of explore the interplay between narratives of personal experience and everyday kind of practices. So what I wanted to do was move beyond the purely textual focus, and as Lauren says here, fuse text, context, and embodied practice. Think about how these kind of different areas of everyday life come together and condition the way in which we understand asylum and the way in which asylum might be experienced. So I did three central things. The first was a focus around discourse and representation, which considered a series of interviews and documentary analysis. So I interviewed an array of asylum seekers and refugees, city councillors, charity volunteers, refugee housing organisations, director of a theatre group who worked to do awareness-raising plays, those kind of things. The co-founders of City of Sanctuary, volunteers there and volunteers at drop-in centres, these kind of things. Alongside this, I also collected a series of kind of documentary evidence from these charities but also from the city council and other organisations. And these were combined with these interviews then to get a sense of the ways in which asylum was being narrated in the city. And they worked to not only give a sense of the kind of tensions and politics of this, but also the way in which ideas of what asylum is, how it relates to Sheffield, and where people could and should be placed are sort of tangentially reproduced through these kind of ideas and narratives. The second approach that I took then was an ethnographic one, and this aimed to effectively, as Fine suggests here, see people in action, or perhaps more precisely, to see people in interaction. So I was interested in the interaction between asylum-seeking individuals and volunteers and others in the city who work with them in some ways. So I attended 2 weekly drop-in centres for a 10-month period, spending the time acting as a student volunteer and researcher. I was open about the aims of my research to everyone in these environments. And over the time period, I got to know a series of what might be some regulars at these sites. I increasingly spoke to them regarding their experiences, I observed what was going on, and I kind of took part in all of the activities of these environments. As my relationships here deepened over this time, I began to kind of become enfolded into other types of practices and other types of events. So I became a kind of helper at charity meetings, theatre productions, festivals, all these kind of different things. Public demonstrations and marches in support of individual asylum cases. So I kind of got involved in all of the different facets of asylum in Sheffield to some extent. So my ethnography then set out to explore the diverse array of social interactions which make up these kind of spaces. And it provided different sort of snapshots of the way in which the city was experienced and understood. And then the final thing that I did was effectively to use what's been termed a diary interview method. And this basically set out to try and explore the connections between memory and experience in the city in different ways. And also some of the kind of topology of daily activity of everyday life. So I asked 2 asylum seekers and 2 refugees who I'd encountered at the drop-in centres to actually keep a diary for me for 3 weeks about their everyday experiences in the city, the way they understood it, the way they interacted with it in terms of the spaces people went to and what they did and all this kind of stuff. So I had a broad set of guidelines, but I left this relatively open. And so these provided then a means to not only acknowledge the emotive elements of asylum experience to some extent, but also to think about the ways in which initial impressions of the city come to actually form a kind of lasting idea of what Sheffield is like, what kind of places and spaces can be interacted with and how, the kind of expectations that are set up around us. So those were the 3 central strands of what I set out to do in terms of my methods. And lying at the heart of this approach then was a belief that partial accounts of practice, narrative and representation, which this kind of provided me with, could never really create a full picture. I would never be able to get to the bottom of what was going on here, how the city was understood, how it's experienced and so on. So the way I tended to view what I effectively produced through the research was this kind of claim, something like, I suppose, from Alan Latham, suggesting an interrelated mosaic of interpretive snapshots and vignettes of a particular social space and set of social practices in the making. Now this might seem quite a modest claim to some extent. It's about minor moments and kind of practices that are constantly being changed and shifted. But I think that this is really significant, because I don't think that there's I think there's a danger in more grandly suggesting that we can get to the bottom of these kind of practices, particularly when, as I was trying to do in my research, I was interested in some of the kind of more than representational elements of experience, of how asylum cannot simply be accounted for through narratives or through celebratory accounts of being a welcoming city and so on. Rather, researching the city in this sense was for me about trying to unpack some of the ways in which all of this is constantly in the making, as is suggested here. So I want to conclude then by thinking about a couple of challenges. And the most obvious of these then emerge from the kind of ethnographic work that I did and some of the observational stuff. So one of the great strengths of this, and yet one of its concurrent weaknesses, was the ways in which this offered a real kind of engagement with social processes and social lives. As such, my ethnography proved to be a messy, demanding, and at times quite emotionally fraught affair. This was the case not least because as individuals, I think we have very little control over the ways in which other people interpret and understand us. The ways in which we're actually kind of viewed by the audiences that we perform for. Despite our best intentions, our bodies are marked with the meanings, interpretations, and expectations of others. And as such, attempting to define how my presence as a researcher was reacted to is kind of futile to some extent. One consequence of which was that whilst I had intentions of undertaking a purely overt ethnography within these drop-in centre environments, the reality of this disclosure shifted and altered throughout the process. The boundaries between the overt and the covert became kind of blurred to some extent, as research encounters occurred increasingly across an array of different spaces and kind of spilled out of one another. There was a messiness here that was really difficult to contain, but partly it was a messiness that was productive. So whilst I made announcements of my status and gained consent from those that I worked with, I can never be completely certain that this disclosure was complete, that the role that I was playing was that of, at least in part, the academic alongside the volunteer. And those positions are really hard to kind of reconcile. The second consequence then of this sort of messy, chaotic nature was that there were a whole range of emotional and personal ties and connections which were forged through this work. And this impacted both on the work itself, but also my own experiences of Sheffield. I lived in the city throughout this time, and so there are a whole set of relationships there. I developed relationships with a number of individuals who came in part to constitute how I came to understand Sheffield as a place to be, and my subsequent memories of it. Through my own engagements with campaigns, marches, deportation hearings, and asylum decisions, I forged a connection akin to some of those that other volunteers described to me in interviews and discussions. Emotions came to the fore at varied points. The immense nerves of my first trip to the drop-in centre, the kind of regret and guilt, I suppose, of my final trip to the drop-in centre, the anger which accompanied witnessing the ways in which the asylum process in the UK warehouses the lives of individuals and wastes lives, effectively. So these emotional dynamics were, for me, critically part of the research, of trying to understand the experiences that circulate the city in relation to this issue. One of the ways in which I actually sought to address this was through writing, keeping a research diary, and I would advocate everyone to do this at all times, no matter what your research, not only to enable you to actually have a sense of where ideas are coming from, how they're developing, and so on, but also as an outlet. Research, any form of research, I think, has an emotional element to it. There are nerves, of course there are. There's fear, there's all these kind of different elements. You don't have to necessarily be doing research in this form for that to be the case. And I think writing provides one outlet for those issues, I suppose. And it became an essential component of what I did. And then a second way in which I tried to sort of reconcile and deal with some of this stuff was becoming involved in a series of political interventions, which kind of directed some of these emotional resources in certain ways. So I got involved in fundraising for asylum charities, anti-deportation campaigns, the work of City of Sanctuary, and so on. So in part, this was obviously another way in which the research spilled over, but it was also a kind of means of reflection and a means to actually sort of try and intervene to some extent. So the final point I want to make then is about commitment. I want to highlight really, particularly in this type of research, if you're kind of doing things around experience in the city, around ethnography, these kind of things, there's a real importance, I think, in commitment, persistence, and patience. I personally didn't feel like I achieved absolutely anything in the first 3 months of my fieldwork. I started in October, I got to Christmas, and I felt like I'd done nothing. But on reflection, in reality, I'd done a hell of a lot. What I'd done wasn't necessarily to produce tangible outputs, I hadn't necessarily lined up thousands of interviews, but I spent time getting to know people and getting to know the environment. And those kind of things, I think, shouldn't be overlooked. You shouldn't necessarily think that the moment you get into the field, you have to have your first interview and everything will be fine. There's an element of time and commitment and patience that I think is essential to kind of consider. The other thing I'd say is that my own research couldn't have taken place without me actually living in the city and actually being engaged in a kind of proximity with what was going on. It was through this proximity that I was able to attend a range of events, such as this is a theatre production, this is Sheffield Lantern Festival. These kind of things meant that I was able to actually engage with what was going on in a kind of everyday level. But it also offered some of that kind of intangible tacit knowledge that you get through living in that environment. And this was kind of accumulated through sort of daily life, effectively. So the final point then around patience. Keep pressing effectively with research. That's a kind of a key element of what I think I learned, was the fact that you have to kind of keep going at these kind of things. So the final thing that I want to say then is possibly a more cautious point, which is one of the things that I feel like I learned isn't terribly grand in any way, but I think is important to bear in mind with this kind of research around experience and ethnography. And this, I think, can be summed up from a quote from Mitchell Dunnier, whose book Sidewalk is an ethnography of homelessness in New York. If you've not read it, it's absolutely wonderful. I would advise Christmas reading for everyone. It's brilliant. Simply as a piece of kind of urban research. So what he suggests is the need to kind of be cautious and watchful about the way in which we actually talk about and represent other people's lives, but also the way in which we talk and write about our own engagements with them, our own engagements as researchers. And I think this is a really important point to take away, which is, he says, though participant observers often remark on the rapport they achieve and how they are seen by the people they write about, in the end, it's best to be humble about such things, because one never really knows. Thank you very much for your time.